and I met with too much resistance. And maybe this is just my limitations, but I couldn't alter the system. And so when COVID hit and there was a crisis, I turned public and I said, okay, let's capacitate you.
Welcome to the Clear Estate Podcast, a discussion series where we get real about estate planning and estate administration in our efforts to disrupt old systems, bureaucracies with technology, content, and a bit of empathy and humor. I'm Davide the co-founder and CEO of Canada's only technology company providing end-to-end estate administration and estate planning services. So Dr. Daren Heyland, amazing person, very thoughtful, very authentic, very genuine, very emotional stories. Background in critical care medicine, so he's seen a lot of things, and he's dedicated his career to helping Canadians prepare for serious illness and incapacity. He is a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Queen's University, a frequent speaker, and he has published over 500 peer-reviewed academic papers. So we talk a lot about estate planning, about the importance of thinking about our will, our power of attorney. We talked about stuff. We talked about how the stuff get divided. We talked about the assets. We talk a lot about the financial aspects of death. I think today we want to talk a little bit more about emotional things, but more practically, what happens if we don't just get hit by the proverbial bus? And for most of us, there's a period of time before passing away where we're incapacitated in one way, shape, or form, or we're not able to actually voice what our preferences are, or how we would want to be taken care of, and who we would want to take care, not only of us personally, but also of our things, and make decisions for us, both about our finances, but also about our care, about where we live, about the music we listen to. And so there's this period of time, and we tend not to want to think about it. We all say, I come from a family where people say, I just want to die. I don't want to go through this. But for most of us, we're going to age, and there's going to be a period of time where we can't make those decisions for ourselves, and we need to think about, and we need to start talking about, as part of estate planning, as part of the conversation around that period of our lives. And we need to think about those questions, the who, the how, and the everything around that. There's a lot of topics around here. There's a lot of things that we mix up. There's MAID, and that's the program in Canada, and various provinces have different versions of this, where you can get a doctor to actually, where you can pick up to a certain point the moment of your death, when your death is certain. And so that's one topic that we talk about in general surrounding this space. But really, very differently, what a good estate plan contains is more thinking and more communication and more decisions around that period of time where one may be incapacitated, the transitioning or the death is actually not certain. It's very interesting, and this is why estate planning must be done on a regular basis, but pretty regularly. Is that if I take just myself, I'm not sure that I'm at 30 years old versus at 50 years old versus at 70 years old, that I know that my views have changed between the age of 20 and late 40s, I would say right now, but my views on that may change in the future as well. And the conversation we're going to have today with Dr. Daren Heyland, who founded Plan Well Guide, and I highly advise all of you to go see Plan Well Guide, because it's amazing, and it forces you to think through these issues. But the thinking evolves through life, and therefore it needs to be refreshed. And the decision making and the communication around these issues need to be refreshed. I don't like to think about death. People don't like to think about death. People don't like to think about incapacity either. I don't think most people enjoy the thought that they would not be capable of taking care of themselves. And that goes from decisions about where one resides, decisions about our bodies, and day-to-day things like going to the bathroom, like what am I going to eat this morning, or when can I get a glass of water? And so there's different types of incapacity, but thinking through that is uncomfortable, but it's important because most of us will go through that period of time. And I think the conversation around that is not just in our heads. It needs to be a conversation with the people that are actually going to take care of us. And that's hard. It's not easy to have a conversation with a child. Hey, what happens when daddy dies? But it's also not easy to have the conversation with a child or a spouse where if I can't take care of myself, this is how I would like to be taken care of. And it's not just about I prefer chocolate ice cream versus vanilla ice cream, but stuff that's really more about values and about preferences. We also don't have all the same attitude towards how we want to fight for life in the sense of how much discomfort are we willing to tolerate and go through for the sake of being alive. Happens very often that with friends, you will have a reaction or somebody will say, well, living like that, it's actually not worth it. And I would rather be dead. And this is why I said earlier, I think it's important to rethink those things at different points in our lives where maybe at 30 you would have a view, but maybe at 70 with grandchildren, well, maybe your tolerance for pain is a little bit higher if you want to continue to see your grandchildren grow. And so these conversations and that thinking, it's something that needs to be done regularly. And it's something that needs to be captured as well, both from a legal standpoint, power of attorney, so who's going to be empowered to actually make the decision, health directives, also more generally, capturing in some kind of way those preferences and those values and how we want to be taken care of. That's really important. And that's what we're going to talk about with our guest today. So on the subject of planning for incapacity, Dr. Daren Heyland truly is an authoritative voice in Canada and around the world. His work shows us that planning isn't about pessimism. It's about protecting your family from medical miscommunication, conflict, and unnecessary headache or heartache. But it's also about protecting ourselves and making sure that our preferences are captured and that we live our lives and live our last days or the last period of our life in a way that we would have wanted. Don't forget to subscribe to the Clear State podcast on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Welcome to our distinguished guest today, Dr. Daren Heyland. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Your professional story has a lot to do with emergency medicine, critical care, decisions made with our families and doctors for the well-being of loved ones that can't speak for themselves. What's your journey, professional journey, that brought you to starting to think about issues of incapacity? And as you shared with me earlier, kind of like thinking through or planning for incapacity, even though sometimes it's not a gradual process, it could just happen. So how did you get there from a journey standpoint?
I guess my lived experience as a critical care physician was being in a situation where I'm managing a patient with life-threatening illnesses, where there's an opportunity that they could die, and there's also an opportunity where they could recover. But in the explaining to family members then that we need to make some, well, life and death decisions, they're already struggling with the angst of having a loved one who is critically ill. And now on top of that, I add a decisional burden that they have to collaborate with me to make decisions about the use or non-use of life-sustaining treatments, which again, could end in death, could end in life, or could end in a health state worse than death, where they're, well, alive, but not able to function, not able to think clearly or move their body, etc. So repeat that over many years of feeling like you're adding insult, adding harm to families who are already stressed because of this decisional burden. And it makes you wonder, well, hey, can we do something different upstream so that people, both the patient and the family unit, are better prepared for that decisional process. And then therefore we can make better decisions with, well, less stress, less angst on those family members. So that was my primary motivation, was my lived experience as a critical care doctor.
Very, very, very hard, correct? Like I think it's those conversations over and over again, not easy. I have doctor friends and it's always an interesting conversation where in my mind decisions are based on an issue tree where you go, okay, go left, 60% chance, go right, 40% chance, and then you can make some kind of probability based decision. I'm assuming that in that hospital room or in that office, when you're having that conversation, it's a lot harder to put numbers and it's a lot harder to put probabilities. And there's emotions on top of that. Like as a professional, like on the other side, I'm not talking about as a family, but as a professional, how do you handle that conversation? I'm always interested in how do people handle hard conversations, and so how do you handle that? And I'm assuming different people react different ways, but what's your thought process going through it?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that there is an emotional burden to these conversations on
Yeah.
both sides of the table, and so it's a difficult conversation. But really, we ascribe in healthcare to what we call a shared decision-making model. So if I was talking to you as a patient and I had to make a very preference-sensitive decision, a decision that could impact not only the quality but the quantity of your life, I would want to explain what's going on or make sure you had an adequate understanding of the disease process, of the treatment options, of the risks and benefits of these various treatment options, and then elicit from you in a more of a structured, systematic way what your values and preferences are. And I can give more details about that in a second. But then the combination of, my input in terms of this is the disease, this is the likelihood, not with precise probabilities as you might have mentioned in your anecdote, but with gestalts. And maybe if we do have data, we can get more precise in those probabilities. But incorporating that with your values and preferences, then we can make a good decision for what's right for you. If I can just extend this conversation a little bit, the problem with incapacity planning is that when people are not able to participate with me in making those decisions, then I'm grabbing a family member, a next of kin, sometimes legally appointed, or through a provincial law, we can have a hierarchy of next of kin who we can then engage to make these decisions. And I'm putting pressure on them to collaborate with me when they don't know what those values and preferences for the patients were. One of the things that our research shows is that if you go into hospital, you're older and you're now incapacitated, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting the medical care that's right for you. So there's a lot of what we call medical error happening. And so if you want to get the medical care that's right for you with the least stress, then you've got to prepare in advance for you to participate in that conversation if it's you, if you're able, or if you're not, then you've capacitated your representative, your loved one, or whoever's going to make decisions for you officially.
Let's talk a little bit about the legal structure around this, and then we can talk a little bit about the decision making. So people heard about like wills and power of attorneys and health directives. Talk to me a little bit about like how does that all work? Like how like what's the difference and what are the tools? And let's say I'm estate planning and I'm thinking about my estate. How do I differentiate all these documents and what's relevant to what?
Good. And this is amazing, right? That we have a doctor on an estate planning conversation.
It's important.
It is. And I've spoken at, law society meetings as well on this topic. And so it's cool that, we're taking this multidisciplinary look at trying to help people think ahead and plan ahead for the finish line. And a big differentiator between mostly what I do and say what a lawyer would do is if you're thinking about death and wills, like what will happen at death or after death with my estate, that's a will. What I'm talking about here is being alive, but not able to function. That's incapacity planning. And sometimes that gets wrapped into estate planning, but it's the poor cousin at the family reunion. Doesn't get much attention, isn't done very well. Current tools are woefully inadequate. Think about it. Think about doing health planning for when you're sick and not able with a lawyer, where you sign a document that says, this is what I want, this is what I don't want, where you don't really have the context of your disease, the possible treatment options, or any advice from a doctor when you are signing a legal document that specifies, what kind of medical treatments you want or don't want. And so we don't encourage at what you use the term advanced medical directives, and got to be careful because there's different terms used in different provinces or different countries. But any sort of medical decision made in advance on a piece of paper in a lawyer's office or at home at the table filling out a form has questionable validity and will be dismissed by a doctor like me who's trying to be sure that to a person I'm talking to, whether that be the patient or their proxy, if the patient's not able to, they have to understand the risks and benefits, treatment options, possible outcomes. And so when a person filled out that paper, did they really know that this and this and this, and I can't deal with that uncertainty. So the document is not helpful when you're making treatment decisions in advance. When we do incapacity planning, what we're trying to codify in a systematic way are people's values and preferences, not decisions, preferences, because those are the inputs that need to come into the conversation with a doctor that participates in a shared decision-making model.
I guess my biggest question in all of this is clearly you're personally coming at this with a lot of empathy and with a lot of thought around values, essentially, and preferences that would go into interpreting what the decision of a person would have been if they had the capacity to actually make the decision.
Yeah.
I mean, this may be a controversial question, but do you think that that healthcare professionals in general are trained or I'm not saying they're not empathetic, but what I'm saying is that are they trained? Are they aware? Is there enough education in general? Or is this a cause that you took upon? And is this education you need to do with the broader public, but also in the health,
Yeah.
in the healthcare system? And again, I don't want to be controversial, but I
Oh,
need to ask the question.
no, I've been at this for over 30 years,
Mhm.
and I think in my research, I've had a sort of internationally renowned research program to help us understand, describe, and then look at ways of improving communication and decision making in the context of healthcare. And I will confess that we, as healthcare providers, do poorly. We do poorly at this because of what I mentioned earlier, the emotional cost, because of a lack of emphasis on training in these soft skills, communication, decision making. We end up in positions where we do these conversations and decision making encounters very poorly. Hence, a high rate of medical error. Hence, a need to be informed as a consumer of healthcare, be you a patient or a family member, and to have the tools to advocate for self or your family member if that's the case. My initial efforts as a health services researcher, as a clinician, was to try and influence the system and say, hey, we got to do a better job. Here's some training kits, here's some tools that we could deploy in the system to improve this. Here's a strategy to prepare patients in advance so that they're ready to engage with clinicians. And I met with too much resistance. And maybe this is just my limitations, but I couldn't alter the system. And so when COVID hit, and there was a crisis in resource availability for critical care and things that we were subjecting people to without really good decisions, I turned public and I say, okay, let's capacitate you so that you're aware of what an ICU is, the decisions that are made, how you can prepare yourself. And that was really the birth of Plan Well Guide.
People don't like to think about this on a regular basis. So, at Clear Estate, we talk to people that are estate planning all the time. And there's a point in time where you're sitting down and you're thinking about stuff, correct? You're thinking about, okay, like one day I'm going to die. This is how I want my estate to be divided. This is how I want to take care of the people that I care about. Um, and then there's the question, which is, okay, so you can't make decisions. Who's going to make decisions for you? And who's going to make decisions about your bank account? And who's going to have the power to plug or unplug?
Yeah.
So tactically, and your website is amazing, and everybody should go see it. But tactically, how should I be thinking about it? Beyond the legality of like who has the authority to actually go in front of a judge and enforce a decision, but how should I think about the values and the how I want to be treated? What's the checklist? Like, how should I be thinking about it?
Yeah. Let me start at a high level and move it down to a low level and interrupt me if you have a further question. But first, we should celebrate when people engage with lawyers or estate planners that they are future-oriented thinking. They're thinking of their future. One of the weaknesses in the whole system is that people are only thinking about death and my estate, right? And so it's an afterthought when the lawyer puts a piece of paper in, well, when you're alive but incapacitated, who will make decisions for you? And in general, there's two or perhaps three types of decisions that need to be thought through in advance as to the who. Who will decide my medical care, my personal care? So if I end up in an institution, what kind of institution, what kind of costs, what kind of food, who can visit me, who has access to my medical records, what are my preferences for quality of life when I'm in that kind of state? And then if you have any sort of a decisional role in a business or in a company, you need to think through, well, if I'm alive but not capable, who am I delegating decisional roles to? So that's the incapacity planning at its finest. But it's not sufficient just to say the who. Who's capacitating that who to make decisions that really reflect your values and preferences? So part of our research has been drilling down how do we best prepare people to be able to communicate their values and preferences that will inform better shared decisions with professionals, with healthcare professionals in the one instance, or other allied healthcare professionals if we're talking about personal care decisions or other legal decisions if we're talking about lawyers. And so that's what Plan Well Guide represents, is a work through module where we ask questions, we provide information, we ask questions to clarify their values, we record those values, we ask elicit preferences, we record those, and you come away with a tool that enables you to collaborate with these professionals. That's one thing the lay public needs to be able to perform well in a shared decision-making model, is they need information and collaborative tools. Think about when you go see your doctor with the white coat on. It's a high anxiety state, and you don't know what questions to ask, you don't know what to say, you don't know really how to engage with that person to get the care that's right for you. That's our job on Plan Well Guide, is to provide you with that information, help you know how to speak in the language that would work best for those professionals, and a tool that will empower you to do such.
It's funny because last time I went to see my doctor, he took my pressure and my heart rate, and he took it in his office, and he said, "That's impossible." And then he sat me outside of his office in this little machine that would do a test every 30 seconds or 45 seconds or whatever.
Yeah.
And then, because my resting heart rate, according to my watch, is like 42 or 43. But in the office, it was like skyrocketing. He's like, "No, you just have this fear of doctors. I don't
Yeah.
know what's going on." So like he
White
just,
coat syndrome.
yeah, white coat syndrome. That's how he called it. And he sat me on the chair, and then all the indicators went down. So basically, the pressure, the heart rate. And he's like, "Okay, you're fine. You can
Yeah.
go away." So what you're describing is high anxiety
Yeah.
of people meeting with professionals, and that clouds judgment as well, correct? Like it would probably clouds decision making. It's
Yeah.
very, very interesting. Give me an example of, and I don't, again, it's not finger pointing. In your experience, give me two extreme examples of values and preferential differences that may impact vastly different outcomes, I would say, in the treatment and or care of somebody that is incapacitated.
Yeah. So an anecdote, if you will. Um, One of our users shared this story with me. Husband's older, in his 70s, collapses in a public place, falls and hits his head. his heart had stopped because of the collapse, banged his head, and so he has a significant head injury. He's revived, he's rushed to hospital, and this poor woman is now sitting in front of a group of doctors after a few days of being in the intensive care unit where they can evaluate his neurological status. And it's clear that A, he can survive this illness, but B, that he has sustained a significant head injury. So this means that if it were a person, the person would be able to say, well, do I want to live but live like that? And that's a preference sensitive decision, right? It depends. Some people value system says live at all costs. Others say, well, I'd rather be dead than live like that. So how does that woman know, what her husband's value system is? Well, that's where now that we've got a plan, will, guide system that codifies that, it helps that woman who wrote me a thank you letter because it gave her the confidence, as sad as it was. She had the confidence knowing that she was executing her husband's wishes when she said, no, he would not want to live like that. Therefore, we withdraw the life-sustaining machines that are keeping him alive, and he passed away comfortably. So that's an example of preference-sensitive decisions that are driven by values. Unfortunately, I'll give you another anecdote. There is a very common approach by clinicians in those kinds of situations where they would say to the family, this is the problem, these are the probabilities, what do you want us to do? And that puts a lot of pressure, a lot of onus on that loved one to make the decision. They feel like they are making the decision. Oh, I can't pull the plug on my grandma. I have heard more than once in my career because they feel that pressure. And we try and say, no, you're not pulling the plug on grandma. We are working together to understand what grandma would have wanted had she ever said anything to you that would show her give us a clue as to her values. And frequently a woman would say something like, well, my grandmother was a fighter. And she would have fought through this. And so the clinician might then infer, well, if she's a fighter, then okay, I'll give her every chance and I'll apply maximum life-sustaining treatments. The part of the conversation is missing in that interaction with that woman's daughter would be that that woman doesn't understand that maximal therapy also means that there's a risk that she could be alive, but in a health state worse than death. And so what Plan Will Guide tries to do is use what we call constraining values tools, where they see the trade-off. Do you want quality or quantity? Do you want comfort or, life-sustaining treatments, which mean machines, which of course we've used a decision aid to explain to them what that all means. And so there's a systematic and best way to elicit values and preferences and codify those so that that daughter or son or whoever can take that conversation and represent that patient optimally so that the patient gets the medical care that's right for them. Is that helpful?
That's it's very helpful. Super, I mean, first of all, super thoughtful. Second, now I'm thinking about myself, so I'll need to take I'll need to take a few moments. Um, it's very, very interesting. We talk about death all the time at Clear Estate and on this podcast, but you talked a little bit about preferences. Am I a fighter or not a fighter? We use the word pulling the plug. We don't want to be insensitive, but everybody knows what we're talking about when we're
Yeah.
talking about that. In Canada, we're talking a lot about assisted dying right now, or healthcare professionals supporting decisions around, death essentially. And
Yeah.
when does that happen? And do you have control? Is there something somebody can do in advance to kind of influence how that happens later? Or once you're incapacitated, it's over in the sense of like you can't influence. I speak as a former lawyer as well, because the capacity issue is always a bit of a question mark. Like if you don't have capacity, then you can't make the decision. Could you really have made the decision before you were incapacitated about what was going to happen in the future? What are your thoughts there? Like, is this something you can think about in advance? And how should somebody think about it?
So I need to make another point about making decisions under conditions of certainty
Hmm.
versus making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So I initially sort of aligned myself with end of life planning, or another word that is used in the public space is advanced care planning. And you would have seen this as a lawyer expressed in documents where it would say something like, when I am dying, this is what I want, or this is what I don't want. So if you have a trajectory towards death, if you have a terminal illness, if you are in the last 6 months of life, those kinds of plans, which should be codified on the healthcare system forms for the use or non-use of life-sustaining treatments, they're called different things in different provinces, but there are
Hmm.
forms that you can get filled out in advance by a clinician that dictate or drive medical care in those last weeks to months of life. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about I'm fine. I cross the street, I don't look, I get hit by a bus. I've now got a serious illness where there's these preference sensitive decisions to be made. And I need to have had codified my values and preferences under conditions of uncertainty. Because when I
Hmm.
talk to the doctor, or sorry, when my loved one talks to the doctor, they don't know certainly that I'm dying. There's always this risk that I could die, but there's a probability that I could recover. But there's a probability that I could recover in a health state worse than death. And that's
Hmm.
why it's preference sensitive. That's why it matters what I would be willing to bear up or bear through or put up with. And that's why it needs to be codified, in advance. And so my interest is in partnering with people like yourselves and others in the estate planning field so that while you have a captive audience, because they've now agreed that they need to think about their mortality and plan for death, they also need to plan for incapacity. So I'm not, and just to close the idea on MAID, I'm not a MAID planner, right? Because MAID is terminal illness or end of life planning. Planable Guide is advanced serious illness planning, where I'm planning for incapacity when I'm still alive, but I can't make decisions for my medical care. And I suppose in the future that might encompass MAID, but not currently in terms of the rest of Canada making advance requests.
It's a great distinction, and I think it's important for people to keep it in mind because people bundle these things. One question that I have for you, and you talk about families, and obviously there's a decision tree by statute and or somewhere in a document as to who has authority beyond preferences, like who has ultimate authority. Have you seen conflict between family members around that care or some of those decisions? And as a healthcare professional on the other side, beyond authority, like maybe somebody has authority, but or maybe, spouse has authority, but children disagree. How do you handle that? And how do you decode preferences, to your point, from the point of view of various people in the family?
Yeah, just to concur that this is a problem, that if you haven't pre-specified the person to make decisions for you, then we are left with sort of a list. It's in a hierarchical form of the closest relative, so maybe if you're an older adult, it would be, your children. But if you've got 9 children and you haven't pre-specified one of them to be your named decision maker, then it would be a collaborative process of them naming one or them coming to the same page on how to care for mom or dad. And so conflicts around these decisions because either the family within itself is having conflict or the family or one or more of the family and the healthcare professionals are are having conflict is real. How do we handle that? Well, it could be solved by advanced planning, advanced serious illness planning, where you're naming an individual and you're giving them your voice. In the absence of that, we struggle to discern what is the voice of the patient, what is the will of the patient. It all comes down to that, not what I want as a son or what she wants as the daughter of that patient, but rather what do we all think mom would have said? And that sometimes takes time. That sometimes prolongs the critical care experience while we work with family or others. We have ethics consults as well, or other healthcare professionals that can help us communicate through and with the family so that we can make the best decision or discern really what the patient's voice is. That's really what it comes down to.
Very, very interesting. A personal question now. You think a lot about end of life, incapacity. How do you live your life? How do you think about risk, and how do you measure risk reward? What's your risk reward formula when you spend your life thinking about these issues and seeing cases like these? And the example that I have is I have a good friend of mine who was a doctor who never used to run in the winter in Montreal. And then as he got older, started running in the winter. And he would always tell me, don't run in the winter because I see all kinds of patients that, broken hips and whatever, 30-year-old running. And now he's older, he's actually running in the winter. And I'm like, what happened there? He's like, well, the reward is higher than the risk, and therefore now I'm running in the winter, notwithstanding the ice. So how are you thinking about this?
Well, I love that question, and thank you for asking it. And it is personal in nature, but let me just share an anecdote of something that happened early in my training when I was attending a man who went to work one day and had an aneurysm in his brain and was now comatose in an ICU on breathing machines with an extremely poor prognosis, meaning, yeah, again, he could survive, but if he survived, it would be, in a very impaired state. And I'm talking to his wife as the next of kin, explaining the bad news and trying to elicit, what do we think he would have wanted in this scenario? Her grief was overwhelming. And you might think it would be in that context, but she later shared with me that they'd had a fight that morning. And she said things, very hurtful things to him as he left for work. And her grief was so overwhelming that she couldn't get that back. She'd never have a chance to say, I'm sorry, or I didn't really mean that, or that I love you. And so, as a critical care physician, I've tried to live my life like Tim McGraw says, live life like you are dying, that this is your last day. And so relationships are really important to me, and making sure that I have that connection with people that are close to me is one way I guide my life values because I recognize my mortality. And I guess the other thing that I don't do is ride a motorbike because I've seen too many accidents as an ICU physician. But other than that, I do try and enjoy life. I just hiked a volcano to experience the thrill of that. So anyway, I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but that's
Well, that is some of the wisest words I've heard in a while. So thank you, and I will, if I can quote you on that in the future, I'll use. I have tears in my eyes right now, so it's quite for sure, and it's hard, correct? Like it's not easy. It's not easy to wake up every morning and think I could die tonight, and therefore let's make sure that everything that I do today is a no regret move.
yeah, yeah.
Because we have emotions, and I'm both Italian and a former attorney, and therefore arguments and things that I regret saying is something that is pretty common for me. But it's great, very, very, very wise. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Daren. And I think we'll probably do a follow-up. We've had a general conversation. I would like to, at some point in the future, maybe get more tactical with some visuals as well, so that people can understand. I invite everybody to go see the website. That was super useful, and it's not something that we'd like to talk about, and it's not something that we like to think about, but the work you're doing is very important. So thank you for coming.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with yourselves because we share this space where we're trying to help people think ahead and plan ahead and embrace their mortality. And so, if people like me and people like you, across the world could break down silos and collaborate and work together, I think we could better prepare people, not just for the end, but that period of incapacity that will be common amongst many of us in the future. So let's keep the dialogue going.
Let's keep the dialogue going. Thank you, Daren.
Thanks again.
This is the Clear Estate Podcast, how we're bringing estate planning and settlement into the 21st century. After each episode, we get to have an amazing chat with Sara. Sara is the head of estate planning and settlement solutions at Clear Estate and our thought leader internally on all things estate planning and settlement. Sara, you heard this.
Yeah.
I mean, I was crying for about like half of the interview.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Oh my gosh, where do I begin? Yeah. Honestly, incapacity planning, like it's really in estate planning, almost treated like an afterthought, right? It's like everyone's focused on the will. And for unfortunately, just not enough, I think, emphasis and attention is placed on actual incapacity planning, which encompasses so much. I mean, what Dr. Heyland was talking about was a lot from the perspective of a medical professional and kind of advanced healthcare directives. But of course, incapacity planning as a whole is much more. There's so much to it, and you could really go super detailed, which is what Dr. Heyland helps folks to do, with what your expectations are around your incapacity planning.
I mean, the one thing I remember is live every day as if you were going to essentially die at the end of that day or the next morning. That was really something. So in incapacity planning, what are the various documents that one like tomorrow I think, okay, there's a high likelihood. I mean, we should all plan for it, but there's a high likelihood that I'll become incapacitated at the end of my journey. What are the documents that I need to put in place in order to be properly covered?
I'll answer that, but I'm going to say first that one thing that I think is super important is that a lot of people are unfortunately like not doing these types of documents until they think they need to, right? But if you're at a moment in your life where you've, maybe received an unfortunate diagnosis or, your health is failing you in some way or another, that is a really hard time to just all of a sudden start doing these types of documents.
Yeah.
Like,
Plus, you might just fall off the stairs and
and you
and
you might physically be, yeah,
correct. Yeah.
so I really think that first of all, let's have the conversations when you're feeling well and not just when, some medical appointment has maybe,
Triggered some thoughts. Yeah.
triggered. Exactly, exactly. And but in terms of what are the documents? I mean, really, we're talking about in most jurisdictions, it's called a power of attorney for property, uh, or a power of attorney for personal care, and these are really the documents that dictate who will be responsible for you uh, if you were no longer able to make decisions for yourself, right? And the power of attorney for property is to deal with, your assets, your finances. And the power of attorney for personal care is to deal with, you as a person and your needs as a person. So including medical needs, but also, where are you going to live? And, depending on the type of incapacity you might face, right? Like, how are you going to be supported, over the period of time that you may be under a power of attorney. The other document that is super relevant to Dr. Heyland's discussion and the work that he does is, advanced medical care directives, right? Sometimes some of this information might be included in your power of attorney for personal care, but sometimes if people want to get super detailed, it might be a different document entirely that details the type of expectations you have around your medical care, right? Including, expectations around end of life care. That's obviously like the biggest, part I find that most people kind of sometimes care very deeply about is what kind of life-saving measures should be exercised or not exercised. But it can include other things too, like, what kind of food that you expect to be able to have access to, like whether you want to have like a window view or, if that's not important to you, like, are you gonna want access to the outdoors? Like,
I pick Ocean View.
Ocean View, yeah, yeah, yeah. Solid choice, solid choice. But it includes things related to your care in general, but also like your medical care details around, medical care and I do find that when you're talking to folks about these things, they either there tends to be two camps. One is the camp that says, yes, I understand that that's important, but I can't deal with that right now. Or I don't really want to look at it right now. And the other camp is like the exact opposite. And they're like, I absolutely want, this, I don't want this. And usually that's because they've either seen it happen with someone else, or they themselves are facing some unfortunate, medical prognosis.
I always find the tough question here is who determines incapacity? Like like at what point, and I mean, you're not a medical professional, I'm not a medical professional, but these documents have to have a trigger. And how does that happen? I mean, there's cases where you fall off the stairs and it's clear, but there's cases where it's slow over time, whether it's dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's, some of these conditions don't just appear
Yeah.
overnight. So how does that happen in practice? And I'm talking to you as a former trust officer. Like how does the professional executor or the appointee in some of these documents, how do they know they should be acting? And I think it's
Yeah.
difficult for family. I mean, it's easy if it's mom or dad and you kind of have control over the bank accounts already and it's kind of happening. But it's a little bit harder when the relationships are less close.
Yeah, I mean it is, but also even in those situations when you're doing it for mom and dad, like you should I would say be concerned with having proof to be able to, to do it because things might be going swimmingly today, but in terms of, maybe you're acting with a sibling and, if things go wrong, I mean, who knows what could come out of it in future, right? And especially what ends up happening most of the time is one child is kind of taking the brunt of the care, whether that's helping with finances or helping physically, get them to doctor's appointments and things like that. And everything is fine until, another child starts questioning, what activities are taking place and things like that. And including, what we see, unfortunately, a lot of in the estate and trust world is that people are questioning the validity of a will because they don't feel like their parent had the capacity, to actually do the will. Of course, you have to have what we refer to as testamentary capacity in order to do the will, right? In order to create a legally valid will. But there's a couple things I'll say about that. Number one, and I think this is really important, and I don't think it's stressed enough. But incapacity really is a gray area. And just because someone has an advanced age disease like dementia, for example, it does not automatically mean that they don't have capacity, including the capacity to potentially update their will, right? So I think that, and quite frankly, like there is a sentiment that, even suggesting that someone, might not be capable of redoing their will is ageist in a way, because a lot of times it comes from, misinformation or misconceptions around, what is actually involved in aging. Like just because your mom forgot, where she keeps the, I don't know, food processor doesn't necessarily mean that she doesn't have capacity to create a legally valid will, right? So I think it's really important to understand that this is a gray area, right? And there are actual, there's types of advanced age diseases that are also fluid as well, right? So somebody might, you see people have good days and bad days, and they may have capacity in certain moments and not others. So it's complicated. Most jurisdictions have folks who are qualified to do capacity assessments, certified capacity assessors. And sometimes they're doctors, but sometimes they're also other types of health care workers, like social
Workers.
workers, et cetera. And they're specifically trained to identify capacity, issues, et cetera. And so that is a really good way to help to understand, whether or not the person actually has capacity, um, if there are concerns. But there is a challenge there, a practical challenge in that, the person who's having their capacity assessed also has to be a willing participant in having their capacity assessed, which is its own, form of a challenge, right? And so I think this actually makes it even more important to do proper incapacity planning, right? The actual standard of power of attorney for property that most people have is referred to as a continuing or an enduring power of attorney for property. That's in common law jurisdictions anyway. And in this type of document, there usually actually is no trigger for when the power of attorney should actually take effect, right? And the reason that's common practice is because it is a difficult area to like assess and actually have somebody, considered incapacitated and have proof and documentation of that. When meanwhile, like there's a flurry of activity that has to happen to like help to, get their bills paid and things like that. So oftentimes for convenience, this is the common practice, which means, by the way, that your physical power of attorney document you should know where it is and it should not be released unless, certain conditions are met, right? So you can add conditions to your power of attorney document, but practically speaking, sometimes it's difficult to fulfill those conditions. Physicians are less and less comfortable with, declaring somebody incapable. And so it becomes
because of
this,
liability issues. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Um, so we've looked at our internal data at Clear Estate. Basically, we can reverse engineer from all the probates that we've filed that the will that you draft after the age of 55 or 60 is essentially the will you're going to die with. And under 7% of wills that are filed at probate have been amended. And almost 90% of the amendments are done within something like 18 months of death. So you're right. So we shouldn't be ageist, and I think we should be very mindful of declaring somebody not capable. But clearly, within the year or two before death, there's something happens, and people start rethinking some of the decisions that they made, and there's a question mark about duress there, obviously, at some point or another, and we all have to think about it. So what happens if you don't have these documents in place? What happens if I don't have a POA, I don't have some kind of a health directive or some document that gives the authority to somebody to make decisions for me on the health side? What happens there?
So on the health side, every province has kind of a hierarchy of family members that be be would be able to make, medical care decisions in the absence of a power of attorney for personal care that clearly, appointed someone. Uh, One of the things about that, though, is that first of all, you're not really choosing. So it doesn't account for whatever family dynamic you might have, including, if you have estranged family members or if you have a spouse that you actually never divorced or, separated from, but you actually aren't, they aren't part of your life for whatever reason. Like it won't account for that, right? So there's a hierarchy that's there. And it also doesn't decide like people that are, at the same tier, that they're all considered equal, right? So your children, for example, would all be part of the same tier. It doesn't differentiate which one of them should potentially make decisions in that
The
event.
favorite child, obviously.
Exactly. So that's for, for healthcare directives. For power of attorney for property, unfortunately, it's not like there's no easy way to deal with it. And it's really court appointed. So your family members, again, there's a hierarchy of who, qualifies or who kind of has the first right to apply. However, it's ultimately the court that's going to have to officially, appoint that person as your power of attorney for property. And that even includes like, I think a lot of people mistakenly believe that it's like automatically their spouse. That actually is not true. There's your spouse would obviously have access to assets that you hold jointly, but they would not have automatic assets to your other assets or to be able to make decisions on your financial decisions on your behalf.
Final thought here, and complicated, but the issue of MAID, so medical assistance, medical end of life assistance. So what we used to call assisted suicide, but there's various names now, and differences between provinces as well and jurisdictions across North America. But the issue of MAID and the issue of incapacity planning, those are actually two very separate and different issues, and related but almost unrelated.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think that's a important probably an important clarification. We do actually get a lot of folks who want to build MAID into their, incapacity planning documents. It's difficult to do that because there are rules and protocols in place, obviously, and those are continuing to evolve, right? Like MAID is relatively new still in the grand scheme of things, and the law, it's one of those things that, legislation changes, and then there has to actually be guidelines and procedures built by the medical profession, right? Which has been going on for a number of years.
And then not all doctors apply them the same way, and yeah, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And of course, there's also philosophical, kind of ethical debates over this, and certainly differences of opinion in how it should be carried out. Um,
Very difficult space.
it's a very difficult space, absolutely. And myself personally, having known and watched people who would have benefited from MAID. Like I really, I have strong feelings about it myself. So I think that everybody, wants to be able to uh, leave leave instructions for, what they expect. But there are some principles around MAID that try to tie in the awareness and kind of the imminence of, a terminal disease with making that decision. So it's very difficult in advance of an actual prognosis, which is when a lot of people are actually saying like, "Oh yes, sign me up," right? And it's like, okay, you're a little too soon, right? So that's the challenge, right? Is when is the right time to actually decide to be able, to do it, to want it, and what kind of capacity do you require to have at that time, before it can be carried out, later, because originally the plan was to, have everyone have full capacity both at the time they decide to have MAID, but also at the time that they have MAID. Well, in practice, in terms of degenerative diseases, that's very difficult to do because then you're almost forcing people to pull the plug ASAP.
Yeah, and I think it's a very difficult debate. And I know, as I said, in Quebec, it's probably like a couple of steps ahead of the rest of Canada when it comes to these things. And it's a real issue where as a doctor, your duty, or as not just a doctor, but a health professional in general, I mean, your duty is to save life, correct? It's not necessarily to prolong it, but at all cost. But it's very difficult when somebody is not capable of saying, and having been aware of a situation recently where the person requesting MAID is going through three or four or five interviews with a team of health
Mm.
professionals, or they're really reassessing, is your decision made? Are you really sure? Are you really sure? Are you
Yeah.
really sure? Uh, to your point, in the case where you have a situation where you're not capable of going through that, then it's
Mhm.
it's it's philosophically, spiritually, religiously, it doesn't really matter. Point is, it's very hard for those professionals to go, okay, yeah, so we're actually we're gonna terminate this person's life because of a document they signed 10 years ago. It's
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's where it's very difficult. Just final thoughts. What's the impact of the Plan Well guide in your experience in the estate planning and settlement space in Canada?
Like I said earlier, like we're not emphasizing and doing enough on incapacity planning and particularly, advanced healthcare directives. And the reality is, with modern medicine, we're living longer, which is fantastic, but you see the rise in advanced age, diseases and I'll also say, like Dr. Heyland pointed out too, that it's not just advanced age diseases. It's what if there is a case scenario situation that occurs to you, right? And I personally have seen a lot of that as well. And we're not, we talk a lot about people who are like 55, 65, but the reality is, bad things unfortunately happen all the time, and it's really, like I said before, it's really difficult to do this type of planning after something has happened, if not impossible, right? And so I can see how, I mean, what Dr. Halen has done really is provide people a way to get themselves educated on what advanced care actually means for them in Canada. And understanding, I mean, there's all sorts of, like, even the terminology that's used, like the types of care, like there are layers upon layers of knowledge and planning that can go into your healthcare directives. And obviously, the more informed you are, the more you're able to create a plan that helps to meet your expectations, but perhaps maybe even more importantly, helps your family to meet your expectations and helps your family to kind of know what to do, or at least know what you would have wanted. Because I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, one of the worst case scenarios is
Not
not
knowing. Yeah.
knowing, right? And I remember my dad passed away several years ago, but I remember he always used to say, yeah, something ever happens to me, like pull the plug, but not too soon, you know? And and I mean, we all laughed, obviously, but like, what did he mean by that? Like what, like like what is too soon? Like how do you
How
decide?
much pain? To Dr. Hillen's point, there's fighters, there's people that want to lead more peacefully. It really
Yeah.
depends.
And like I know in my heart what my dad would have wanted. And at the end of the day, it was, I mean, he had very unexpectedly, he had endocarditis, which is basically like inflammation around your heart, and it caused a massive stroke. And he did fight, really hard, but he only survived for about a week. And so we didn't really have to make those decisions because his body did what his body needed to do. But that was, I could tell you, the worst week of my life trying to figure out what he would have wanted. It didn't matter that I poked and prodded, him to kind of do that kind of planning, given my professional expertise. I mean, to 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 not know, I mean, I consider us lucky in the sense that, things transpired the way that they were meant to transpire. But had there been questions as to what could be done medically, it would have been a very, very difficult road for my whole family. So, these are the kinds of things that you don't like, you can anticipate what it's going to be like in the moment. And I think also you can't anticipate what's going to go on with your loved ones, in those moments. And even like generational differences between, my mom's perspective, my perspective, or personality. I have two brothers, and like we all came to the table with our own perspectives and our own expectations, right? And they don't always align. I mean, it's normal for them not to align, right?
So bottom line is incapacity planning. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it needs to be done before, because after it's too late, and it can happen. It can
Exactly.
happen I mean, at any point. And so don't wait too late. Sara, thank you so much. That was a great chat, obviously, with Dr. Heyland, and your thoughts are always super helpful.
Thank you.
Please don't forget to subscribe to the Clear State Podcast on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform to make sure that you have access to this podcast and all new information, new content that we may put out there. Our very, very ambitious goal is to end the end-of-life burdens of Canadian and American families and bring products, services, technology, and content to you to help you deal with some of these difficult issues.
ThinkBait. TNKR Media. Good talk.